I spent 30 years studying German military doctrine, not because I admired them, because I needed to understand how professional soldiers became instruments of atrocity. Between 1936 and 1945, 26 men received the Field Marshal's baton from Adolf Hitler. They believed it came with a sacred covenant: glory, honor, immortality, and one unbreakable rule: a German Field Marshal never surrenders. By 1945, that covenant was shattered. Some broke it themselves. Others died defending it. This is the complete accounting of how every single one answered for what they built. My name is Colonel James Mitchell, United States Army, retired. I commanded a battalion in Vietnam. I taught military history at West Point for 15 years. And I've dedicated the last 4 decades to answering one question: how do honorable men enable dishonorable acts? I'll show you 6 men who embody different responses to impossible choices. Their fates reveal a pattern, one that should terrify anyone who wears a uniform. The Field Marshal's baton was not simply a rank. It was currency in Hitler's economy of ambition. To understand what these men lost, you first have to understand what they believed they were gaining. The title reached back centuries. Frederick the Great had elevated it to mythic status. Bismarck's wars had made it sacred. Hindenburg and Ludendorff had embodied its power in the First World War. To become a German field marshal was to enter an aristocracy of command, to be untouchable, unquestionable, immortal in the annals of military history. Hitler understood this mystique better than anyone. He weaponized tradition itself. The baton became a tool of psychological warfare, aimed not at enemies, but at his own generals. Perform brilliantly, and you would join the pantheon of German military greatness. Fail, and you would be discarded like a broken instrument. Between 1936 and 1940, 8 men received the baton during Germany's string of victories. Poland fell in weeks. France collapsed in 6. The Wehrmacht seemed invincible, and these promotions appeared to confirm what the recipients desperately wanted to believe: that professional military excellence could remain separate from political evil, that serving brilliantly in an evil cause was somehow different from serving the cause itself. They were wrong, but by the time they understood that, it was too late. The average age at promotion was 58. These were not young firebrands. They were career officers who had spent decades climbing the ladder of military hierarchy, men with families, pensions, reputations built over 30 years of service, men who had too much to lose, which made them easier to control. Hitler offered them one more thing: the illusion of partnership. He made them believe they were guiding the Reich, when in fact they were simply executing his will with professional precision. What they called a promise was actually an invoice, and the unspoken rule that a German field marshal never surrenders was the chain that bound them. 6 men will show you what that chain cost. Wilhelm Steinberg was 50 years old when he received the baton, the youngest man Hitler ever promoted to that rank. They called him the Desert Lion. His men would have followed him into hell, and on the burning sands of North Africa, they very nearly did. Steinberg was not a Nazi. Let me be clear about that from the start. He never joined the party. He rarely attended political rallies. His religion was military excellence, and his God was tactical perfection. He believed, truly believed, that a professional soldier could serve Germany without serving the regime. That honor resided in how you fought, not who you fought for. This was the delusion that would kill him. In the spring of 1941, Steinberg arrived in North Africa with orders to stabilize a collapsing front. The Italians were being routed. British forces were advancing. Berlin expected disaster. Steinberg delivered miracles instead. He understood something fundamental about desert warfare that the British had not yet grasped. In the desert, there were no flanks, no natural barriers, no cities to anchor defensive lines. Everything was fluid. Victory belonged to whoever moved fastest and struck hardest. Steinberg moved like lightning. His trademark was the reconnaissance in force. While British commanders sat in headquarters plotting methodical advances, Steinberg would be 30 miles behind their lines, cutting supply routes and spreading chaos. He commanded from the front, often personally leading panzer columns into battle. His radio operators could barely keep up with him. The Battle of Gazala in May 1942 showed Steinberg at his absolute peak. The British had constructed an elaborate defensive line stretching from the Mediterranean coast deep into the desert. Minefields, fortified boxes, artillery positions. It looked impregnable. British commanders were confident. They had numerical superiority, better supply lines, more tanks in reserve. Steinberg studied their positions for 3 days. Then he did something completely insane. He sent his entire armored force on a sweeping left hook around the southern end of the British line, 150 miles through trackless desert, moving at night over 2 days, carrying every drop of fuel and water they would need, gambling everything on speed and surprise. The panzers moved in radio silence. British reconnaissance aircraft saw nothing but empty sand. When dawn broke on May 27th, Steinberg's tanks were already behind the main British positions, tearing through supply depots and headquarters units that had never expected to see combat. The British armor rushed south to contain the breakthrough. This was exactly what Steinberg wanted. He had positioned his anti-tank guns in a shallow basin invisible from the desert floor. The British tanks charged forward and drove straight into a killing zone. Within 2 hours of contact, the British had lost over 100 tanks. Their offensive capability was shattered. By early June, they were in full retreat toward Egypt, and Steinberg's forces were advancing on Tobruk. Winston Churchill stood before the House of Commons in London and spoke words he must have hated to say. "We have a very daring and skillful opponent against us, and may I say across the havoc of war, a great general." Hitler promoted Steinberg to Field Marshal on June 22, 1942, the youngest man to ever hold the rank under the Third Reich. He was 50 years old. The Desert Lion had reached the summit of military glory. He had 18 months to live. But in June 1942, Steinberg did not know this. He knew only that the baton felt heavy in his hands, heavier than it should. In his private letters to his wife Lucia, he began writing things he had never written before. "I wonder if we understand what we are building. I wonder if victory would even be recognizable if we achieved it." Lucia saved these letters. After the war, they would become evidence of doubt. But doubt without action is just noise in your own head. And Steinberg was a soldier. Soldiers follow orders. So he pushed his doubt down deep and kept fighting. That was his first mistake. It would not be his last. Heinrich Vogel was the opposite of Steinberg in almost every way. Where Steinberg led from the front, Vogel commanded from maps. Where Steinberg improvised brilliantly, Vogel planned meticulously. Where Steinberg questioned privately, Vogel obeyed absolutely. Vogel was 52 years old when he took command of the 6th Army in January 1942. He was the very model of a Prussian staff officer. Precise, disciplined, unimaginative, but utterly reliable. His superiors loved him because he never argued. He accepted orders, calculated the logistics, and executed the plan exactly as written. Obedience was his religion. It would become his damnation. In the summer of 1942, while Steinberg was winning glory in North Africa, Vogel was preparing for the greatest offensive of his career. Operation Blue, the drive toward the oil fields of the Caucasus. Hitler believed this offensive would win the war, capture the Soviet oil, and the Red Army would grind to a halt. Capture the oil, and Germany could fuel its war machine indefinitely. Vogel's 6th Army would be the northern pincer of this vast offensive. Their objective was a city on the Volga River, an industrial center of minimal strategic importance. Its only significance was its name, Stalingrad. The initial advance was textbook perfect. Vogel's forces crossed hundreds of miles of steppe in a matter of weeks. Soviet resistance crumbled. By August, the 6th Army had reached the outskirts of Stalingrad and prepared to take the city in a swift, brutal assault. It should have taken days. It took months. Urban warfare is hell on earth, and Stalingrad became the deepest circle. The city was a landscape of rubble and ruins. Every factory was a fortress. Every apartment block was a bunker. Every pile of debris concealed a sniper or a machine gun nest. Soviet defenders fought with suicidal determination. They contested every room, every floor, every stairwell. German soldiers called it Rattenkrieg, rat warfare. You could spend an entire day fighting for a single building, capture it at sunset, and find Soviet troops back inside by dawn. The 6th Army bled into that city. Thousands of men ground down to nothing in a war of attrition that devoured divisions. Vogel sat in his headquarters 20 miles west of the city, moving colored pins on maps, calculating casualty ratios, requesting reinforcements. He was winning, technically. German forces controlled 90% of the city by November, but his staff officers were bringing him troubling reports. Soviet forces were massing north and south of the city. Large formations, tank armies, artillery concentrations. Something was coming. Vogel sent these reports up the chain of command. He recommended pulling back to more defensible positions before winter. He suggested creating mobile reserves that could respond to a flanking attack. Hitler's headquarters dismissed his concerns. The Führer had personally ordered that Stalingrad be taken. There would be no retreat, no contingency planning. The city would fall. That was the plan. Vogel was a soldier. Soldiers follow orders. So he ordered his men forward into the frozen ruins and waited for the hammer to fall. It fell on November 19, 1942. Ernst Richter was 61 years old and had been retired for 8 months when the hammer fell at Stalingrad. His retirement was involuntary, heart problems, chronic illness. The official reason was health. The real reason was that Richter had become a problem. He kept asking questions, not loudly, not publicly, but in private meetings with fellow officers. Richter had begun expressing doubts that could not be tolerated. Questions about strategic objectives, questions about treatment of occupied populations, questions about orders that seemed to violate every principle of military honor he had spent 40 years upholding. So they retired him, gave him a pension, thanked him for his service, and hoped he would fade away quietly. Richter did not fade. He sharpened. Retirement freed him from the obligation of obedience. He could finally say the things he had been thinking for years, and what he said attracted attention from men who had been thinking the same things, but lacked the courage to speak them aloud. By late 1942, Richter was at the center of a growing network. Officers, clergy, diplomats, civil servants. Men who believed that Hitler was leading Germany toward absolute catastrophe and that the only way to save the nation was to remove him from power. They met in private apartments in Berlin. They spoke in careful euphemisms. They debated endlessly about means and methods. Could Hitler be arrested, tried, forced to abdicate, or would he have to be killed? Richter had no illusions about what they were planning. It was treason. Under military law, under civil law, under any interpretation of their oaths, what they were discussing was treason. But Richter had come to believe something that would have been unthinkable to him 5 years earlier. Sometimes disobedience is the highest form of duty. He had been a soldier since before the First World War. He had served the Kaiser. He had served the Weimar Republic. He had served the Third Reich. He had always believed that a soldier's obligation was to obey legitimate authority. But what happened when authority became illegitimate? What happened when the state itself became criminal? Did obedience remain a virtue, or did it become complicity? Richter wrestled with these questions through the winter of 1942. In his study, late at night, he would read the old Prussian military codes, the ones about honor, duty, responsibility. And he would ask himself, what would Frederick the Great have done? What would the old Prussian officers, men of genuine honor, have done in this situation? He knew the answer. They would have resisted. They would have placed duty to the nation above obedience to any individual leader. So Richter made his choice. If the conspiracy needed a military leader with the authority and reputation to command the Wehrmacht after Hitler was removed, he would be that man. He was a field marshal. Retired, yes, but the rank remained, and with it came obligations that transcended politics. His choice would cost him everything, but he made it anyway, because he believed it was the right choice. Sometimes that has to be enough. While Richter was planning resistance, Victor Adler was enabling atrocity with a fountain pen. Adler was 59 years old and held one of the most powerful positions in the German military, chief of the high command of the armed forces, the OKW. He sat at Hitler's right hand through every major strategic conference. He translated the Führer's volcanic rages into precise military directives. He was also the most despised man in the German officer corps. They called him Lacatel, a play on his name that meant lackey. The contempt was universal. Real combat commanders viewed him as a spineless bureaucrat. Staff officers saw him as a yes man with no moral compass. Even Hitler sometimes treated him with casual disdain. But Adler never objected, never pushed back, never resigned in protest. He simply nodded, clicked his heels, and signed whatever document was placed before him. And the documents were monstrous. The Commissar Order, issued in June 1941, mandated the immediate execution of captured Soviet political officers. No trials, no prisoners. Just line them up and shoot them. This was a direct violation of the Geneva Convention in every principle of military law. Adler signed it. The Night and Fog Decree, issued in December 1941, ordered that resistance fighters in occupied territories should be made to disappear. No records, no trials, no notification to families. They would simply vanish into concentration camps. Adler signed it. The anti-partisan directives issued throughout 1942 and 1943 authorized collective punishment of civilian populations. 10 hostages executed for every German soldier killed. Entire villages burned in reprisal for attacks on supply lines. Adler signed them all. One afternoon in August 1943, a staff officer brought a new directive to Adler's office for review. The young officer hesitated before placing it on the desk. His hands were shaking slightly. "Sir, this directive, it orders reprisals against civilians. 50 hostages to be executed for every German soldier killed by partisans in the Balkans." Adler barely looked up from the previous document he was signing. "The Führer has approved it. Type the final version. I will sign." "Sir, under the Hague Convention, collective punishment of civilians is—" "Captain." Adler's voice was flat, empty. "We are not here to debate international law. We are here to win a war. Do you have a problem with that?" The captain stood very still. He was young, maybe 25. He had joined the Wehrmacht believing it was an honorable profession. Now he was being ordered to type a document that would kill civilians who had done nothing except live in the wrong village. "No, sir, no problem." "Good, type it. I need it by end of business today." The captain typed it. Adler signed it. 3 weeks later, a village in Serbia was burned to the ground. 53 civilians were executed and left in the town square as a warning. Adler signed dozens of such orders, hundreds perhaps. He never visited the villages, never saw the bodies, never met the families. He simply signed his name and moved to the next document. Other generals despised him, but hatred required them to acknowledge their own complicity, because the orders Adler signed were carried out by field commanders who could have refused, who could have resigned, who could have done something other than follow criminal orders. They did not refuse. They did not resign. They followed orders, just like Adler did. And when the reckoning came, every signature would be evidence. Adler did not think about the reckoning. He thought about the next document, the next meeting, the next directive from the Führer. He was a cog in a machine, and cogs do not question. They simply turn. This was his choice, and he would answer for it. Otto Brenner was 54 years old and had earned a reputation as the man you sent when everything was going to hell. They called him the Führer's fireman, not because he put out fires, because he kept things burning just a little bit longer. Brenner was a true believer, not in Nazi ideology. He had never bothered much with politics, but he believed in duty, in discipline, in the absolute obligation of a soldier to fight until ordered to stop. He believed that will could overcome impossible odds, that determination could substitute for resources, that a commander's job was to demand the impossible and then make it happen through sheer force of personality. This made him extremely valuable. It also made him extremely dangerous. In the summer of 1944, after the catastrophic collapse of Army Group Center on the Eastern Front, Brenner was sent to stabilize what remained. 300,000 men had been killed or captured in the span of 3 weeks, the largest defeat in German military history. Entire armies simply ceased to exist. Brenner arrived to find chaos, units without commanders, commanders without units, supply lines that existed only on maps, soldiers streaming west in disorganized retreat. He stopped the retreat through methods that would be considered war crimes by any standard. Officers who counseled withdrawal were relieved of command immediately. In some cases, they were executed on the spot for defeatism. Soldiers who fell back without orders faced drumhead courts-martial. The penalty was always the same. Brenner restored order through terror, and it worked, tactically. The retreat stopped. Defensive lines stabilized. Army Group Center, though shattered, continued to exist as a fighting force. But the cost was measured in German lives sacrificed to buy time for a cause that was already lost. Brenner did not care about the strategic situation. He cared about the orders. Hold this position. That was the order. So he held it, regardless of casualties. In December 1944, Hitler selected Brenner to command German forces in the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive of the war. A desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace. Brenner executed the plan with fanatical energy. The initial assault achieved complete surprise. American forces were overrun. Entire divisions collapsed. For 72 hours, it looked like the impossible might happen. Then American reinforcements arrived. The weather cleared, allowing Allied aircraft to fly, and the offensive ground to a halt in frozen forests and small Belgian towns, drowning in its own blood. Brenner kept attacking, kept throwing divisions forward into hopeless assaults, kept demanding the impossible, because that was his duty, because the Führer had ordered this offensive, because a soldier fights until ordered to stop. He would follow that principle all the way to a forest in the Ruhr. But that comes later. In the winter of 1944, Brenner was still fighting, still believing that will could overcome reality, still demanding that his soldiers die for objectives that no longer mattered. This was not honor. This was fanaticism. But Brenner could not see the difference. Franz von Hartmann was 57 years old and possessed perhaps the most brilliant strategic mind in the German military. His plan for the invasion of France in 1940, the famous sickle cut through the Ardennes, had been a masterpiece of operational art, a gamble so audacious that it should not have worked. But it did, and France fell in 6 weeks. Hartmann understood warfare at a level few officers ever achieve. He could visualize campaigns across thousands of miles in months of time. He could anticipate enemy reactions 3 moves ahead. He could see vulnerabilities in defensive positions that other commanders missed entirely. He was also morally flexible in ways that Richter could never be. Hartmann commanded in Ukraine during 1941 and 1942. This was the zone where the Einsatzgruppen, the SS murder squads, conducted their mass executions of Jews, Roma, Soviet officials, and anyone else deemed undesirable by Nazi ideology. Hartmann knew what was happening. It was impossible not to know. The shootings took place within miles of Wehrmacht positions. SS reports crossed his desk. His own soldiers witnessed the murders and talked about them. Hartmann never ordered the killings, never participated directly, but he never stopped them either. Never filed protests with Berlin, never restricted SS access to areas under his command. He simply looked away and focused on military operations. This was his choice. Not action, but inaction. Not commission, but omission. He told himself he was not responsible for what the SS did. His job was to fight the Red Army, not police the actions of other German organizations. This was a comfortable lie. He was the senior military commander in the region. He had the authority to refuse SS requests, to restrict their movements, to file formal complaints that would have created a paper trail of objection. He did none of these things because it would have complicated his military operations, because it would have created conflict with Berlin, because it was easier to focus on tactical problems that had clean solutions rather than moral problems that did not. After the war, Hartmann would write his memoirs. They would become influential texts studied in military academies around the world. In them, he would present himself as a pure soldier, a professional who served Germany, not the regime. A man who had simply done his military duty while trying to limit the damage. The memoirs would sell thousands of copies. They would shape how a generation understood the German officer corps. They would allow Hartmann to live out his final years as a respected military thinker rather than a war criminal. But the people who died in Ukraine while he commanded there did not get to write memoirs. This was Hartmann's choice, and unlike some of the others, he would live long enough to profit from it. November 19, 1942. The hammer falls. At dawn, Soviet artillery opened fire on the Romanian positions north and south of Stalingrad. Not a preparatory bombardment, a hurricane. The earth itself seemed to be coming apart. Shells fell so thick that individual explosions merged into one continuous roar. Then came the tanks, hundreds of them. T-34s and heavy KVs, rolling forward in mass formations that simply crushed the Romanian defenses. Within hours, the Romanian Third Army had ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Survivors were streaming west in panic. The same scene played out south of the city. More artillery, more tanks. The Romanian Fourth Army shattered like glass. By November 23rd, the two Soviet pincers had met at Kalach, a small town 40 miles west of Stalingrad. The jaws had closed. The Sixth Army was encircled. 300,000 men trapped in a pocket roughly 30 miles across, with winter approaching and supplies running low. Vogel received the reports in his headquarters. He studied the maps. The situation was clear. The Sixth Army needed to break out immediately, while they still had fuel, while they still had cohesion, while there was still a gap to the west that could be exploited. He prepared the orders for a breakout, put his staff to work calculating routes and logistics. Then he sent a message to Hitler's headquarters requesting permission to withdraw from the city and fight west toward German lines. The response came back within hours. The Sixth Army will hold Stalingrad. No retreat. The Luftwaffe will supply the army by air. Relief forces are being organized. Hold your positions and await relief. Vogel read the order 3 times. He showed it to his chief of staff. Sir, this is impossible. The Luftwaffe cannot deliver the tonnage we need. We require a minimum of 300 tons per day just for basic subsistence, in winter weather, with Soviet fighters contesting every flight. It cannot be done. I am aware of that. Then we must break out now, before the encirclement hardens, before we lose the capacity to move. Vogel stared at the map for a long time. Every instinct he possessed was screaming that his chief of staff was right. But the order was clear, and Vogel was a soldier. Soldiers follow orders. Transmit to all commands. The Sixth Army will hold current positions. We will await relief. His chief of staff opened his mouth, closed it, saluted, left to transmit the order. Vogel remained at the map. He knew what he had just done. He had condemned the Sixth Army to death or capture, but the Führer had given the order, and a German Field Marshal obeys. This was his choice. He would have 2 months to regret it. December 1942 was hell-frozen solid. Temperatures dropped to 30 below zero. The Luftwaffe tried desperately to fulfill Hitler's impossible promise. Transport planes flew through blizzards and Soviet fighters, landing on improvised airstrips inside the pocket, unloading what supplies they could, taking off again through curtains of anti-aircraft fire. They delivered an average of 100 tons per day. The Sixth Army needed 300 just to survive. Forget ammunition, forget fuel. Just to eat and stay warm, they needed 300 tons. Men began to starve. Slowly at first, then faster. The daily ration was cut, then cut again, then cut again. Soldiers were eating horses, then they ran out of horses. They boiled leather. They searched frozen corpses for scraps of food. The cold was worse than the hunger. Frostbite claimed thousands. Men lost fingers, toes, entire limbs to the cold. Those who could still fight huddled in ruins and bunkers, burning furniture to stay warm, wrapping themselves in whatever fabric they could find. Soviet forces tightened the noose. Artillery bombardments every day, infantry assaults every night. The pocket shrank. 10 miles, 5 miles, 3 miles. The Sixth Army was being compressed into an ever smaller space, with corpses piling up faster than graves could be dug in the frozen earth. Vogel remained in his command bunker, moving the colored pins on his map as units ceased to exist. Sixth Army had started with 14 divisions. By January, most existed only as battalion-strength remnants. Some had been reduced to company strength. Some had simply vanished. On January 30th, 1943, 11 years to the day after Hitler took power, a radio message arrived from Berlin. Vogel opened it in his bunker with his remaining staff officers present. To Colonel General Vogel, in recognition of your heroic defense of Stalingrad, you are hereby promoted to Field Marshal, effective immediately. Adolf Hitler. The bunker was silent. Every man there understood what this meant. Hitler had just given Vogel a loaded gun and pointed it at his own head. No German field marshal had ever surrendered to an enemy. Not in the Kaiser's wars. Not in the wars of Frederick. Not ever. It was the unbreakable rule, the core of the covenant. A field marshal died before surrendering. The message was clear. You know what is expected. Vogel stared at the paper for a very long time. His officers waited. Outside, Soviet shells were falling. Inside, the radio crackled with reports of final defensive positions collapsing. Finally, one of his staff officers spoke quietly. "Sir, we could break the radio, claim we never received the promotion. You would still be a colonel general. You could surrender as a colonel general, not as a field marshal." It was technically possible. A legal fiction, a way out. Vogel shook his head. "No, if I am a field marshal, then I am a field marshal. I will not hide behind technicalities." But he did not reach for his pistol. He did not walk outside to meet a Soviet bullet. He sat in his bunker and waited for the end. It came on January 31st, 1943 at dawn. Soviet tanks were 200 meters from Vogel's command bunker. 91,000 men survived from the original 300,000. They were beyond fighting, beyond even standing, most of them. Vogel called his staff together one final time. "Gentlemen, prepare to surrender." The words hung in the cold air. They were the most important words any German field marshal had ever spoken. They broke a covenant 2 centuries old. Officers began removing their sidearms, placing them on tables. One by one, the weapons piled up. The symbolic disarmament of an army that no longer existed. A white flag was raised over the headquarters bunker. Soviet soldiers approached cautiously, weapons ready, expecting a trap. When they entered the bunker and found exhausted German officers waiting quietly, they seemed almost confused. "You are Field Marshal Vogel?" "I am." "You are surrendering?" "I am." The Soviet officer stared at him for a long moment. Then he gestured toward the exit. "Come with me." Vogel walked out of the bunker into the frozen morning. Behind him, the Sixth Army began surrendering in groups and clusters. Thousands of men emerging from ruins and bunkers, hands raised, too weak to even walk. Soviet soldiers directed them toward collection points. Many would not survive the march to prison camps. Most would never return home. Vogel was placed in a command car and driven east. He did not look back at the ruins of Stalingrad. The news reached Hitler that afternoon. His rage was legendary. Officers in the conference room heard him screaming through concrete walls. How dare Vogel surrender? How dare he break the covenant? Every man in that army should have died, should have shot themselves, should have chosen death over the shame of capture. But the news also reached every other German field marshal. In France, in Russia, in the Balkans, in Italy. 25 men who wore the baton and believed in the covenant. The message was unmistakable. The silver and ivory offered no sanctuary. It was a chain with Hitler's hand on the other end. And the promise of immortality was just another weapon in his arsenal. Steinberg read the report in his headquarters in France. He sat very still for a long time. Then he wrote a short entry in his private journal. "Vogel surrendered. A field marshal surrendered. I would not have believed it possible. But he was trapped. His men were dying. What choice did he have? What choice will any of us have when our turn comes?" Richter read the news in Berlin. It confirmed what he already knew. The regime would sacrifice anyone, would demand any sacrifice, would break any rule in pursuit of a war that could not be won. His conspiracy meetings intensified. They needed to act before more men like Vogel were placed in impossible positions, before more armies were destroyed for Hitler's pride. Adler read the report and immediately drafted a memo condemning Vogel's cowardice. It was filed with the other memos. Another document signed. Another piece of paper that would become evidence. Brenner read the news on the Eastern Front and felt nothing but contempt. Vogel was weak, should have died fighting, should have held until relief arrived, should have done anything except break the sacred rule. Brenner would hold that belief all the way to a forest clearing in the Ruhr. But that comes later. Hartmann read the report and immediately began analyzing the strategic implications. The loss of the Sixth Army was catastrophic. The entire southern front was now vulnerable. New defensive positions would need to be established. He began drafting operational plans. He did not waste time on moral questions about surrender. That was not his job. His job was to win battles with the forces he had available. Someone else could worry about honor and covenants. 6 men, 6 different responses to the same news. Each response revealed character, and character would determine fate. By February 1943, 13 field marshals remained alive and in command. 9 more would receive the baton before the war ended. But what they had believed was protection now lay exposed as illusion. Every man who wore that rank now understood something that changed everything. They could die, they could be sacrificed, they could be discarded. The baton offered no shield. Honor was not armor. And the rule about never surrendering was just another way to control them. Some would try to escape through resistance, some through fanatical obedience, some through strategic brilliance and moral flexibility. None of them would succeed, because the bill was already written, and history was preparing to collect. The news of Vogel's surrender spread through the German military like infection. Not officially, the regime tried to suppress the details, but soldiers talk. Officers write letters. Information leaks through 1,000 cracks in the apparatus of control. By March 1943, every field marshal in the Wehrmacht understood that Hitler's word meant nothing. He could demand your death whenever it became convenient. What had seemed like a sacred compact was revealed as manipulation. Some men responded by tightening their grip on duty. If the covenant was broken, then obedience became even more important. Discipline, order, following commands to the letter. These things could still have meaning even if honor did not. Other men began to question everything. Ernst Richter was one of them. Through the spring and summer of 1943, Richter's conspiracy grew like a shadow network beneath the surface of German military life. Officers who had served together, men who trusted each other, conversations that started carefully and grew bolder as each participant realized the others shared their doubts. They met in private apartments in Berlin, never the same location twice, never more than 6 or 7 at a time. They used code words, they kept no written records. They understood that discovery meant death. The group included army officers, Luftwaffe commanders, civilian officials, even a few aristocrats with connections to the old Prussian elite. What united them was a single belief. Hitler was destroying Germany, and the only way to save the nation was to remove him from power. They debated methods endlessly: arrest, trial, forced abdication. Each option had complications. Hitler was protected by SS bodyguards who were fanatically loyal. He rarely appeared in public anymore. His movements were unpredictable. Any attempt to seize him would require military forces willing to turn their weapons on their own comrades. That meant they needed senior officers who could command loyalty from their troops. Officers with the rank and authority to give orders that would be followed even in the chaos of a coup. They needed field marshals. Richter was the first. Retired, yes, but the rank remained. More importantly, he had the reputation. 40 years of service, decorated in 2 wars, known as a man of principle. If Richter called for Hitler's removal and claimed leadership of the Wehrmacht, many officers would follow. But Richter alone was not enough. They needed younger commanders, men who still held active positions, men who controlled actual combat forces rather than ceremonial authority. In late 1943, the conspiracy reached out to Wilhelm Steinberg. The approach was careful, oblique, a conversation that could be interpreted as theoretical if necessary. Steinberg was in France, preparing defenses against the Allied invasion everyone knew was coming. He was sitting in his headquarters reviewing coastal fortifications when a colonel he had served with years before requested a private meeting. They walked together along the beach at Normandy. Atlantic wind, gray sky, concrete bunkers being constructed by forced labor crews. The colonel spoke quietly. "The war is lost. You know that." Steinberg said nothing, kept walking. "The Americans and British will invade. We cannot stop them, not with the forces we have, not with the strategic situation in the East. Germany will be destroyed unless someone makes peace before that happens." Still, Steinberg said nothing. Peace is impossible while Hitler leads. He will never negotiate. He will fight until every German city is rubble, until the nation is erased from the map. Someone has to stop him. Now Steinberg stopped walking, looked at the colonel. What are you asking me? I am asking if you love Germany more than you fear consequences. The question hung between them. Steinberg could report this conversation. The colonel would be arrested within hours, tortured for names, executed. The conspiracy would be exposed and crushed. Or Steinberg could answer honestly. I love Germany. I have always loved Germany. Everything I have done has been for Germany. Then help us save it. What do you want from me? When Hitler is removed, we need officers to secure the Western Front, to prevent chaos, to maintain order while a new government negotiates with the Allies. We need you to hold your command together during the transition. Steinberg resumed walking, thinking. The colonel walked beside him, silent now, waiting. Finally, Steinberg spoke. I will not participate in assassination. I am a soldier, not a murderer. Understood. I will not give orders that result in German soldiers fighting each other. Civil war would be worse than continuing the current path. Agreed. But if a legitimate government emerges after Hitler's removal, and that government orders me to maintain my positions and open negotiations with the Western Allies, I would follow those orders. It was not a commitment. It was not even explicit support, but it was not refusal. It was the careful statement of a man trying to navigate between honor and pragmatism, between duty and conscience. The colonel nodded slowly. That may be enough. Thank you for your time, sir. They never spoke of it again directly, but Steinberg knew. He was now connected to the conspiracy. Not a full member, not an active participant, but connected. Passive complicity, the most comfortable position, the illusion that you can stay neutral while standing in the middle of a war. It would cost him everything. While Richter built his network and Steinberg occupied his careful middle ground, Victor Adler continued signing documents. The paper kept flowing through his office. Directives, orders, reports. Everything required the chief of OKW's signature before implementation. Adler signed them all with the same mechanical efficiency. In April 1943, a directive crossed his desk regarding treatment of Allied prisoners of war who were recaptured after escaping. Previous policy had been to return them to prison camps. The new directive ordered their execution. Immediate, without trial, no exceptions. This was a direct violation of the Geneva Convention. Allied governments had already warned that execution of POWs would result in war crimes, charges after the conflict ended. Every legal advisor in the Wehrmacht had counseled against implementing such a policy. Adler signed it anyway. In August 1943, another directive arrived. This one dealt with partisan activity in occupied territories. The previous policy of taking hostages had proven insufficient to deter resistance attacks. The new policy was simpler. For every German soldier killed, an entire village would be destroyed. All residents executed. All buildings burned. Adler's staff officer hesitated before placing the document on his desk. Sir, this directive essentially legalizes mass murder of civilians. It will create thousands of war crimes cases. Adler looked up from the previous document he was reviewing. Has the Führer approved this directive? Yes, sir. His signature is on the authorization. Then prepare the final version for my signature. Sir, after the war? After the war is not your concern. Your concern is typing this directive so I can sign it before the end of the day. Do you understand? The staff officer stood at attention. His jaw was tight. His hands were clenched at his sides. Yes, sir, I understand. Good, dismissed. The officer typed the directive. Adler signed it. 3 weeks later, a village in Yugoslavia was surrounded by German troops. Every resident was forced into the church. The church was set on fire. 117 people burned alive. Similar scenes played out across the occupied territories. Hundreds of villages, thousands of civilians. Every death authorized by a signature on a piece of paper. Adler never visited these villages. Never saw the bodies. Never met the families. His war was fought with fountain pens in a comfortable office in Berlin. Clean, efficient, removed from consequence. But every signature was documented. Every order was filed. The paper trail was perfect. and paper trails become evidence. Adler did not think about trials, did not imagine courtrooms or judges or sentences. He thought about the next document, the next meeting, the next directive from the Führer. He was a machine. Machines do not worry about the future. They simply process the present. This was his choice, and the bill was accumulating interest. By early 1944, the conspiracy had grown large enough to attempt action, but it still lacked a critical component, a weapon. You cannot remove a head of state with meetings and good intentions. You need force. In a military dictatorship, that meant either military units willing to turn on the regime or a more direct solution, a bomb. The choice was made in March 1944. One man would carry a bomb into Hitler's presence, place it as close as possible, detonate it, and in the chaos that followed, the conspiracy would seize control of the government and military. They selected Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg for the role. He was an aristocrat, a decorated combat veteran who had lost an eye, an arm, and 2 fingers to an Allied air attack in Tunisia. He was recovering from his wounds but still held a staff position that gave him access to Hitler's headquarters. More importantly, Stauffenberg was willing to die. He understood that placing the bomb likely meant his own death. He accepted that, believed it was necessary, believed Germany's survival was worth any individual sacrifice. Richter met with Stauffenberg twice in the spring of 1944. They sat in a Berlin apartment and discussed the operational details: how to get the explosives, how to construct the bomb, how to trigger it with one hand, how to get close enough to Hitler for the blast to be lethal. After the explosion, what happens? Stauffenberg asked. Chaos, but controlled chaos. I will be at Wehrmacht headquarters. The moment we receive confirmation of Hitler's death, I will issue orders under Operation Valkyrie. Operation Valkyrie was an existing emergency plan designed to mobilize reserve forces in case of domestic uprising. Richter and the conspiracy had quietly modified it. Instead of putting down an uprising, the forces would be used to seize control of government buildings, arrest SS leadership, and establish military control over Berlin. And if he survives? Stauffenberg asked. He will not survive. Not if you place the bomb correctly. But if he does? Richter was silent for a moment. Then we all die. Quickly if we are fortunate, slowly if we are not. Stauffenberg nodded. He had already accepted that possibility. Then I will place it correctly. July 20th, 1944. The date that would define everything that followed. Stauffenberg flew to Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia, the Wolf's Lair, a complex of concrete bunkers and wooden buildings hidden in dense forest. Hitler was scheduled to attend a military conference at 12:30. Stauffenberg would be present as part of a briefing on replacement units for the Eastern Front. The bomb was in his briefcase, 2 pounds of plastic explosive, a chemical fuse that would give him 10 minutes after activation, enough time to place the briefcase and leave the room without arousing suspicion. At 12:30, the conference began. Hitler stood at a large oak table studying maps. Surrounding him were 24 officers and staff. Stauffenberg placed his briefcase under the table, as close to Hitler as possible. The table was heavy oak, but the building was wooden. The blast should be sufficient. At 12:36, Stauffenberg excused himself. A telephone call from Berlin. Urgent. Would the Führer excuse him for a moment? Hitler barely looked up, waved him away. Stauffenberg walked out of the conference room, down the hall, out of the building. He walked quickly but did not run. Running would attract attention. He passed 2 security checkpoints, showed his identification, maintained the appearance of routine business. At 12:42, the bomb detonated. The explosion tore through the wooden building like a grenade in a box. The oak table split. Bodies were thrown against walls. Windows shattered outward. Smoke and dust filled the air. Stauffenberg was 200 meters away. He saw the explosion, saw the building disintegrate, saw smoke rising. No one could survive that. No one. He had a car waiting. He drove immediately to the airfield, flew back to Berlin. By 3:00, he was at Wehrmacht headquarters reporting to the conspiracy. Hitler was dead. The bomb had worked. Operation Valkyrie was now in effect. Richter received the news in his office. He stood slowly. This was the moment. Everything they had planned, everything they had risked. It was happening. He picked up the telephone and began issuing orders. This is Field Marshal Richter. The Führer has been killed in an SS coup attempt. The army is assuming temporary control to restore order. All Wehrmacht commanders are ordered to arrest local SS and Gestapo leadership. Secure all government buildings. Wait for further instructions. The orders went out across the Wehrmacht radio network. To Paris, to Vienna, to Prague, to Berlin garrison commanders. In some locations, officers immediately began executing the orders. In others, they hesitated, waited for confirmation. For 4 hours, the conspiracy was winning. Troops were mobilizing, SS officers were being arrested, government buildings were being secured. In Paris, the military governor arrested every SS officer in the city. And then at 6:28 p.m., Hitler's voice came over the radio. German people, I am speaking to you today so you can hear my voice and know I am unharmed. A small clique of ambitious officers attempted to eliminate me and seize power. The attempt has failed. I am well. The traitors will be dealt with. The conspiracy collapsed in minutes. Officers who had been following Valkyrie orders suddenly stopped. Some claimed they had been deceived. Others simply froze, unsure what to do. The arrests stopped. In some cases, the SS officers who had been detained were released with apologies. At Wehrmacht headquarters, Richter sat at his desk listening to Hitler's voice. He placed his hands flat on the desk surface. He did not move for a long time. An officer entered the room, young, uncertain. Sir, what are our orders? Richter looked at him. He thought about lying, about claiming he had also been deceived, about trying to survive the next few hours. But he had spent 40 years building a reputation for honesty. He would not end it with a lie. Lock the door. Destroy any documents related to today's activities. Then wait. Sir, the Gestapo will be here within the hour. There is nothing more to do. The Gestapo arrived in 40 minutes. Richter did not resist. He stood when they entered, allowed them to place handcuffs on his wrists, walked quietly to their vehicle. Stauffenberg was arrested at Wehrmacht headquarters. He was taken to a courtyard. No trial, no questions. Just a firing squad assembled in the darkness. He and 3 other conspirators were executed by 11 more that night. But Richter was a field marshal. His death required more theater. The trial took place on August 7th and 8th, 1944. The People's Court. Judge Roland Freisler presiding. The courtroom was set up to humiliate the defendants. Bright lights, cameras rolling. The proceedings would be filmed and shown in cinemas across Germany as a warning. Richter was brought in wearing civilian clothes. They had taken his uniform. They had taken his belt, so he had to hold up his trousers. They had taken everything that marked him as a soldier. He stood before the court looking like a beggar. Freisler was a small man with a shrill voice who compensated for his physical insignificance by screaming. His technique was simple. Shout down the defendant. Prevent them from speaking coherently. Create an atmosphere of chaos that made reasoned defense impossible. He screamed at Richter for 20 minutes, barely paused for breath. Traitor, coward, disgrace, oath-breaker. Every insult he could summon poured out in a torrent of rage. Richter stood silently, held his trousers with one hand, waited. Finally, Freisler demanded a response. You swore an oath to the Führer. You betrayed that oath. You attempted to murder your supreme commander. What do you have to say? The courtroom was silent. Everyone waited. The cameras rolled. Richter spoke quietly but clearly. I swore an oath to Germany. I have served Germany for 40 years. When the Führer became Germany's enemy, my oath transferred to saving what remained of the nation he was destroying. Freisler exploded. His voice cracked with rage. You dare claim that removing the Führer was serving Germany? Yes. You are a traitor and a coward. Richter looked directly at him. His voice remained calm. I am the only man in this room who remembered what honor means. You will hang me, Herr Freisler. You will film it and show it to the public. You will try to make an example of me. But history will remember which of us was right, and it will not be you. Freisler screamed for 10 more minutes, but he had lost control of the moment. Richter's dignity had created a contrast too stark to ignore. A man in ill-fitting clothes holding up his trousers, speaking calmly about honor and duty, versus a judge in black robes screaming insults. The verdict was never in doubt. Guilty. Sentence, death. August 8, 1944. Plötzensee Prison, Berlin. They hanged Richter with piano wire. Not rope, piano wire. It was a specific humiliation Hitler had ordered. The wire was thin, the drop was short, death by slow strangulation rather than a broken neck. Richter was led into the execution chamber at 5 p.m. A meat hook mounted on the wall, the wire looped over it, the other end placed around his neck. He did not beg, did not plead, did not ask for mercy. He stood straight while they prepared the wire. His final words were quiet, spoken to no one in particular, maybe to himself. I did what I believed was right. That will have to be enough. They pulled him up by the wire. His feet left the ground. The wire bit into his neck. He struggled involuntarily, the body's automatic fight for air. But he did not cry out. It took 20 minutes. The entire execution was filmed. Hitler ordered the footage sent to his headquarters. He watched it twice. Ernst Richter was the first field marshal to die in the aftermath of July 20th. He would not be the last. The Gestapo investigations continued through August and September. They arrested 7,000 people, tortured confessions, followed every lead. The conspiracy had reached further than anyone had realized. Dozens of officers, hundreds of civilians. Some had been active participants. Others had simply known and not reported. Under torture, names emerged. One of those names was Wilhelm Steinberg. The evidence was thin. He had not planted the bomb, had not issued Valkyrie orders, had not attended conspiracy meetings, but he had been approached, had been asked for support, and he had not reported the approach to authorities. Passive complicity. It was enough. Hitler faced an impossible problem. Steinberg was not Richter. He was not an old staff officer that the public barely knew. Steinberg was the Desert Lion, the most famous German commander of the war, the man whose tactical brilliance had made him a legend, the face on 1,000 propaganda posters. Putting Steinberg on trial would be catastrophic. The public would not accept it. Soldiers would question everything. The entire mythology of the Wehrmacht's honor and professionalism would collapse. But Hitler could not ignore the connection, could not let it slide without consequence. Every other conspirator was being executed. How could he spare a field marshal? So Hitler devised a solution that was characteristically cruel. On October 14, 1944, two generals arrived at Steinberg's home in Herrlingen. They carried with them a simple offer, an ultimatum disguised as mercy. Steinberg was working in his study when they arrived. His wife Lucia showed them in. They requested to speak with him privately. Lucia left the room but remained nearby. She knew something was wrong. The generals were formal, polite. They did not sit. Field Marshal, we bring an offer from the Führer. Steinberg said nothing, waited. Your name has emerged in connection with the July 20th conspiracy. The evidence suggests you were approached by the plotters, that you were aware of their intentions, that you did not report this to proper authorities. I see. The Führer has authorized us to present you with two options. The first is this. One general opened a small wooden box. Inside was a glass capsule, cyanide. You take the capsule now. Within 15 minutes, you will be dead. Your death will be announced as a result of your war wounds. You will receive a state funeral with full military honors. Your wife and son will receive your pension. Your family name will remain untarnished. And the second option? You refuse the capsule. You are placed under arrest. You stand trial before the People's Court. Given the evidence, conviction is certain. Sentence will be death by hanging. Your family will be arrested under Sippenhaft. Collective punishment. Your wife, your son, they will face charges as family members of a traitor. The room was silent. Outside, autumn leaves were falling in the garden. Ordinary life continuing while this moment happened. Steinberg understood immediately. This was not mercy. This was murder with a choice about method. Hitler needed him dead but could not afford a public trial. So he was offering Steinberg the illusion of control over his own death. Take poison and die a hero. Refuse and die a traitor while your family suffers. How long do I have to decide? You must decide now, Field Marshal. We cannot leave without your answer. Steinberg stood, walked to the window, looked out at his garden, at the home he had bought with his wife, at the ordinary peaceful life he had thought would follow the war. He thought about his son Manfred, 15 years old, his whole life ahead of him. If Steinberg refused the capsule, Manfred would be arrested, sent to a camp, probably killed. He thought about Lucia, his partner for 25 years. She had followed him through every posting, had endured every separation, had never complained. She would face the same fate. He thought about honor, about duty, about whether any principle was worth sacrificing your family to uphold. And he realized there was no choice. There had never been a choice. Hitler had made certain of that. I would like to say goodbye to my wife and son. Of course. Steinberg left the study, found Lucia in the hallway. She read his face immediately. Wilhelm, it is time. I am sorry. She did not cry. Not yet. She held his hands. You have nothing to apologize for. You served with honor. I am not certain honor matters anymore. It matters to me. It will matter to Manfred. It will matter to history. They stood together for a long moment. Then Steinberg called for his son. Manfred came down the stairs, 15 years old, still growing into his frame, still innocent of how cruel the world could be. Steinberg tried to find words, tried to explain, finally settled for simple truth. I am going away, Manfred. I will not be coming back. Take care of your mother. Study hard. Remember that a man's character is measured by his choices, not his victories. Manfred did not understand, not fully, but he knew something terrible was happening. Father? No questions. Just remember, I love you. I have always loved you. Steinberg embraced his son, held him tight. Then he let go and walked back to the study before his resolve could break. The generals were waiting. Steinberg picked up the capsule, looked at it. Such a small thing. Such enormous consequences contained in colored glass. Will you keep your word? About my family? You have the Führer's word. It was worthless. Everyone knew it was worthless. But it was all Steinberg had. He placed the capsule in his mouth. Bit down. The cyanide acted within seconds. His legs gave out. The generals caught him and lowered him to the floor. He convulsed once, twice, then was still. 15 minutes after the generals had arrived, Wilhelm Steinberg was dead, 52 years old, one of the greatest tactical commanders of the 20th century, murdered by ultimatum. The regime announced his death 3 days later. War wounds, they said, injuries sustained in combat, a hero's death. The Führer sent a wreath. Thousands attended the state funeral. Lucia stood at the grave and said nothing. She knew the truth. Everyone who knew Steinberg knew the truth, but no one could speak it aloud. In the history books written during the war, Steinberg died a hero. In the history books written after the war, the truth emerged slowly. Murder by ultimatum. The desert lion destroyed by the very regime he had served with distinction. Passive complicity had cost him everything. The comfortable middle ground had collapsed beneath his feet. In the end, neutrality was impossible. You were either with the resistance or you were with the regime. There was no third option. Steinberg had tried to find one anyway, and it had killed him. The purge continued through October and November. Hundreds of executions. The conspiracy was being rooted out with systematic brutality. Every connection was followed. Every name was investigated. Every suspect was tortured until they provided more names. But while the Gestapo was hunting conspirators in Germany, the military situation was deteriorating everywhere. The Soviets were advancing on the Eastern Front. The Allies had broken out of Normandy and were driving toward Germany from the west. Italy had switched sides. The Reich was being crushed in a vice that tightened daily. Field marshals who had nothing to do with the conspiracy were being consumed by the collapsing front. Some by combat, some by political necessity, some simply by the grinding mathematics of defeat. Otto Brenner was still fighting, still believing that will could overcome reality, still demanding the impossible from men who had nothing left to give. In December 1944, Hitler gave him one final mission, the Ardennes offensive. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major attack, a desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace. Brenner executed the plan with fanatical determination. The initial assault achieved complete surprise. American positions were overrun. Entire divisions collapsed. For 3 days, it looked like the impossible might happen. Then the Americans regrouped. Reinforcements arrived. The weather cleared, allowing Allied aircraft to dominate the skies, and the offensive ground to a halt in frozen forests and small Belgian towns, drowning in its own blood. Brenner kept attacking, kept throwing divisions forward, kept demanding one more push, one more assault, one more impossible effort. His staff officers begged him to stop. The casualties were unbearable. They were achieving nothing. The offensive had failed. Brenner refused. "We attack until ordered to stop. Those are our instructions. We follow instructions. Sir, the men will do their duty, as will we. Prepare the next assault." By January 1945, the Ardennes offensive was over. Germany had lost 120,000 men, irreplaceable losses. The strategic situation was worse than before the attack began. But Brenner had followed orders. He had done his duty. He had fought until ordered to stop. This was what remained of honor in his mind. Not wisdom, not preservation of life, just obedience. Obedience to the end and beyond. He would carry that principle to its logical conclusion in April. But that comes later. By February 1945, the Reich had weeks left. Maybe months if you were optimistic. The Soviets were approaching Berlin from the east. The Americans and British were crossing the Rhine from the west. Germany was being torn apart. In his bunker in Berlin, Hitler was planning one last card to play, one last manipulation of the men who wore his baton. Hermann Kruger had been at Hitler's side since the earliest days of the Nazi Party. Reichsmarschall, the only man to hold a rank above Field Marshal, designated successor to the Führer himself. But by April 1945, Kruger had become a liability, morphine-addicted, obese, incompetent. The Luftwaffe he commanded had ceased to exist as an effective force. Allied bombers flew over Germany unopposed. Kruger had promised to defend the Reich from air attack. He had failed completely. Worse, he had begun sending messages suggesting that perhaps the time had come for negotiations, that perhaps Hitler should consider terms, that perhaps continuing the fight was pointless. Hitler interpreted this as preparation for coup. Kruger was in Bavaria, safe from Soviet advance. Hitler was trapped in Berlin, and Kruger was sending telegrams asking if maybe he should assume leadership of the Reich if Hitler remained in the capital. On April 23, 1945, Hitler exploded. He ordered Kruger stripped of all rank, expelled from the Nazi Party. Placed under house arrest for treason, 22 years of partnership destroyed in a single telegram, the Reichsmarschall was now a prisoner. The designated successor was now a traitor. The man who had been at Hitler's right hand since the beginning was now just another failure to be discarded. Kruger received the news in his Bavarian estate. He sat in his study surrounded by stolen art, paintings looted from across Europe, treasures accumulated through corruption and theft, the spoils of rank. He poured himself a drink, then another, then a third, and he began to understand something that should have been obvious years earlier. What they had called a promise was always just another chain, and now the man holding the leash was cutting it. 2 weeks later, Germany surrendered. Kruger surrendered to American forces. He expected to be treated as a head of state, to negotiate terms, to perhaps serve as an intermediary between the Allies and whatever German government emerged from the rubble. Instead, he was placed under arrest as a war criminal, headed for trial at Nuremberg. The Reichsmarschall, who had believed rank would save him, discovered that rank meant nothing when the regime that created it no longer existed. By May 8, 1945, the shooting war was over. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had lasted 12. Of the 26 men who had received Field Marshal batons from Hitler, 11 were already dead. Suicide, execution, combat, or simple chance. 15 remained alive to face judgment. Some would face it in courtrooms, some in Soviet prison camps. Some would escape it entirely through luck or legal technicality. But the psychological weight of what they had enabled would follow every survivor for the rest of their lives. The bill was coming due, and this time, there would be no escape through obedience. May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. Church bells rang across the Allied world. Soldiers celebrated in the streets of Paris, London, New York. The war in Europe was over, but for 15 German field marshals still breathing, the war had merely changed form. The shooting had stopped. Now came the reckoning. The bill they had postponed through obedience, through brilliance, through carefully maintained neutrality, that bill was now unavoidable. Geography would determine their fates, but every single one would face judgment in some form. Some fled east, hoping to disappear into the chaos of a shattered continent. Some surrendered to Western forces, gambling that American or British captivity would be preferable to Soviet revenge. A few simply waited in their homes for a rest, too exhausted to run. None of them escaped. Geography determined the court, but every single one faced consequences. The only variables were the sentence and how long they would live to regret their choices. I told you at the beginning that I would show you 6 men who embodied different responses to impossible situations. You have seen 4 of them answer already. Vogel, who broke the covenant and lived as a defector. Richter, who resisted and died on a meat hook. Steinberg, who hesitated and died by forced poison. Adler, who enabled everything and signed his way toward the gallows. 2 remain. One who believed so completely in duty that he chose death over dishonor, and one who survived everything through strategic brilliance and moral flexibility. Their fates will show you the final truth. History does not forget, and no amount of tactical genius protects you from judgment. April 21, 1945. The Ruhr Industrial Region. Otto Brenner stood in his command post studying maps that no longer corresponded to reality. Army Group B was encircled. 300,000 men trapped in a shrinking pocket. American forces controlled every road, every bridge, every escape route. His staff officers had been arguing with him for days. The situation was hopeless. Ammunition was exhausted. Food supplies would last another 48 hours at most. Medical supplies were gone. Wounded men were dying in the streets for lack of basic treatment. The Americans were offering surrender, reasonable terms. The war was over. Everyone knew it was over. Continuing to fight was just spending lives for no purpose. Brenner listened to these arguments with an expression of stone. We have our orders. Hold our positions. Fight until relieved or until ordered to withdraw. Those are the orders. Sir, there will be no relief. There is nothing left to relieve us with. Berlin is surrounded. The Führer is trapped in a bunker. The chain of command has collapsed. Until I receive orders to the contrary, we hold. His chief of staff, a colonel who had served with Brenner for 3 years, finally lost his patience. Field Marshal, with respect, you are condemning 300,000 men to death or Soviet captivity for nothing. No strategic objective, no tactical advantage. Just obedience to orders that no longer matter. Brenner turned to face him. His voice was quiet but carried absolute conviction. A soldier who stops fighting because he decides the orders no longer matter is not a soldier. He is a mutineer. I will not become a mutineer. I will not order my men to become mutineers. We fight until ordered to stop. And if those orders never come, then we fight until we cannot fight anymore. The colonel stared at him, trying to understand, trying to find some logic in the position. Finally, he asked the question directly. Why? What are we dying for? Brenner was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of something that might have been doubt, or might have been certainty so absolute it resembled madness. We are dying because we swore an oath. Because a soldier's word must mean something even when everything else has lost meaning. Because if we surrender our honor, we have nothing left at all. The colonel had no response to that. What could you say to a man who had confused honor with suicide, who had made obedience into a religion that required martyrdom? On April 18th, Brenner made his final decision. He would not surrender Army Group B, but he would not condemn his soldiers to die for his principles either. He issued orders disbanding the Army Group, releasing every soldier from his oath of allegiance. They were free to surrender individually, free to make their own choices, free to survive if they could. But Brenner himself would not surrender. could not surrender, because the rule that had defined his entire identity still bound him even as everything else collapsed. He told his staff he was going for a walk, alone. They should not follow. They understood what he meant, but no one tried to stop him. Perhaps they were too tired. Perhaps they respected his choice. Perhaps they simply no longer cared. Brenner walked into a small forest near Duisburg. Birch trees, spring growth, birds singing, an ordinary German forest on an ordinary spring day. He drew his service pistol, a Walther P-38. He had carried it through 4 years of war. It had never been fired in combat. He had always believed officers led from maps and radios, not from pistols. Now the pistol had one final purpose. Brenner sat down with his back against a birch tree. He thought about his wife, his children, the life he would not return to. He thought about the soldiers he had commanded, the men he had ordered executed for retreating, the divisions he had thrown into hopeless assaults. He thought about whether any of it had mattered, whether duty and discipline and obedience had served anything except the prolongation of catastrophe. And then he stopped thinking, because thinking was the enemy of action, and he was a man of action. He placed the pistol barrel under his chin, angled upward, professional, efficient. He pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the forest. Birds scattered. Then silence returned. German soldiers found his body 3 days later, still in uniform, still wearing his decorations, still clutching the pistol. He had died exactly as he had lived, following the rules to their absolute conclusion. Otto Brenner was 54 years old. He never faced trial, never answered questions in a courtroom, never confronted the consequences of the orders he had given or the men he had condemned. He simply walked away, called it honor, and died alone in a forest. I have thought about Brenner for 40 years, tried to understand him, and I still cannot decide if he was the most honorable of the 6 men I have shown you, or the most cowardly. He died for principle, but the principle was obedience to a regime that had already lost every shred of legitimacy. He refused to surrender, but surrender would have saved 300,000 lives. He called it honor, but honor that serves no purpose except self-satisfaction is just vanity with better marketing. Maybe Brenner understood that at the end. Maybe that is why he chose a forest instead of facing his own soldiers. Maybe shame was stronger than honor after all. Or maybe he genuinely believed he was doing the right thing, that a soldier who breaks his oath, even to an evil cause, has broken something that cannot be repaired. I do not know. I will never know, because Brenner took his answers with him. While Brenner was walking into his forest, the bureaucratic machinery of justice was grinding into motion. The Allies had been planning war crimes trials since 1943. Lists had been compiled, evidence had been gathered. The International Military Tribunal was being organized, and at the top of every list of military defendants was one name: Victor Adler, chief of OKW, the man who had signed the criminal orders, the man who had been present at every major conference, the man who had translated Hitler's words into military directives that killed millions. Adler was captured by British forces in May 1945. He surrendered without resistance, seemed almost relieved to be done with it all. The British placed him in a detention camp to await trial. He was transferred to Nuremberg in August 1945. The trial would begin in November. He would have 3 months to prepare his defense. He spent those months writing, drafting explanations, constructing arguments. He was a staff officer. Staff officers solved problems with paperwork. Surely he could write his way out of this. His defense strategy was simple. He was a soldier following orders. He had no authority to refuse directives from the Führer. He had no responsibility for how those directives were implemented in the field. He was simply a transmission mechanism between political leadership and military execution. It was the same defense dozens of defendants would use. It would fail for the same reason every time. The Nuremberg Tribunal had been specifically designed to reject it. The trial began on November 20th, 1945. 22 defendants in the dock. Adler sat between Joachim Jodl, another staff officer who had signed criminal orders, and Julius Streicher, a propagandist whose newspaper had incited genocide. The evidence against Adler was overwhelming. His signature appeared on dozens of orders that violated international law. The Commissar Order, the Commando Order, the Night and Fog Decree, anti-partisan directives that authorized mass murder of civilians. The prosecution presented each document methodically, read them aloud in court, showed Adler's signature, asked if he acknowledged signing them. He acknowledged everything. Never tried to deny his signature, never claimed the documents were forged. His defense was simpler. He had to sign them. Following orders was not a choice. The prosecutor, a British barrister named Maxwell Fyfe, destroyed this argument with surgical precision. Field Marshal Adler, you held one of the highest ranks in the German military, correct? Yes. You had the authority to refuse assignments you found objectionable? Theoretically, yes. Did you ever refuse an assignment? No. Did you ever request to be relieved of your position as chief of OKW? No. Did you ever file a formal protest against any order you were asked to sign? No. So when you say you had no choice, what you actually mean is that you chose not to exercise any of the choices available to you, correct? Adler sat silently. The question had no good answer. Maxwell Fyfe pressed forward. You signed the order mandating execution of Allied commandos captured behind enemy lines. Yes or no? Yes. You knew this violated the Geneva Convention? I was informed it might be controversial. Controversial. 50 commandos were executed under this order, Field Marshal. Shot without trial. Their families were told they died in combat. Was that controversial? I did not implement the order. I only signed it. And that signature gave the order legal force. Without your signature, it could not have been implemented, correct? That is correct. So every man executed under that order died because you chose to sign it. Would you agree with that statement? Silence. Field Marshal, would you agree? I was following orders. Maxwell Fyfe's voice dropped to almost a whisper. That is not a defense. That has never been a defense. You were a field marshal. You had choices, and you chose to enable mass murder with a pen stroke. That is what we are here to judge. The trial continued through the winter. 10 months of testimony, thousands of documents, hundreds of witnesses. The evidence accumulated into a mountain that buried any possibility of acquittal. On October 1st, 1946, the verdicts were read. Adler was convicted on all counts. Crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity. The tribunal found him responsible for transmitting and implementing orders that resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands. The sentence was a death by hanging. Adler listened to the verdict without visible reaction. He had known it was coming, had known from the moment of his arrest that this would be the outcome. Still, hearing the words made it real in a way that abstract knowledge could not. He was taken back to his cell. Execution was scheduled for October 16th. 2 weeks to live. Hermann Kruger sat in cell number 5, 3 doors down from Adler. He had also been convicted, also sentenced to death. But Kruger was not resigned to his fate the way Adler was. Kruger had spent his entire life finding angles, exploiting weaknesses, gaming systems. He had risen to power through manipulation and cunning, had accumulated wealth through corruption, had survived 20 years at Hitler's side by reading the political winds and adjusting accordingly. He would find an angle here too. Through the summer and fall of 1946, Kruger worked on his captors. Charmed guards, requested special privileges, slowly, carefully built relationships. He was pleasant, cooperative, made small talk, remembered names and families. One guard had a daughter who wanted to study art. Kruger discussed painting techniques with him. Another guard collected stamps. Kruger talked about his own collection, stolen from across Europe, but he did not mention that part. He was building credit, creating debts, establishing himself as a human being rather than a war criminal. And humans help each other, even in prison. Somewhere in this process, through means that were never conclusively determined, Kruger obtained a cyanide capsule. The most likely theory is that a guard provided it, perhaps for money promised from Kruger's hidden assets, perhaps out of sympathy, perhaps because Kruger convinced him it was a mercy. The guard was never identified with certainty, and every guard assigned to that cell block denied involvement. However he obtained it, Kruger hid the capsule for months, perhaps in the seam of his mattress, perhaps in a crack in the cell wall, perhaps in a place so obvious that searchers never thought to look. The exact hiding place died with him. He kept it hidden through daily cell searches, through medical examinations, through the trial itself, and he waited for the right moment. October 15th, 1946, the night before execution. The guards made their final rounds at 10 p.m. Lights out, silence in the cell block. At 10:45 p.m., Kruger removed the capsule from wherever he had hidden it, turned it over in his hands. Such a small thing, such absolute power. He thought about the gallows being prepared in the gymnasium, about the rope, about the drop, about dying slowly in front of witnesses and cameras, about giving his enemies the satisfaction of watching him hang. No, he would not give them that. He had spent his entire life controlling his own fate. He would control this too. Hermann Kruger bit down on the capsule at 10:47 p.m. The cyanide acted within seconds. Violent convulsions, foam at the mouth, then stillness. A guard found his body during the 11:30 check, raised the alarm, but it was far too late. The Reichsmarshal was dead. He had cheated the hangman by 43 minutes. The authorities were furious, launched investigations, interrogated every guard, searched for the source of the capsule, never found conclusive evidence. The mystery remains unsolved to this day. But the message was clear. Even in death, even in defeat, Hermann Kruger had exercised control, had made a choice, had denied his executioners the satisfaction of justice completed. Some people called it courage. Others called it cowardice. I call it characteristic. Kruger had spent his life looking for angles in working systems. His final act was entirely consistent with everything he had been. The next morning, October 16th, 1946, Victor Adler walked to the gallows that had been meant for two men. The execution chamber was a gymnasium in Nuremberg prison. 3 gallows had been constructed. The executions would proceed one at a time. Witnesses seated in chairs, cameras rolling, everything documented. Adler was led in at 1:00 a.m. His hands were bound behind his back. He walked steadily. No stumbling, no resistance. The executioner was an American sergeant named John Woods. He had hanged dozens of men. He was professional, efficient, but not particularly skilled. The drops were often miscalculated. Death was not always instant. Adler stood on the trap door while the noose was placed around his neck. He was asked if he had any final words. "I call on the Almighty God to have mercy on the German people." Nothing about the crimes, nothing about the orders he had signed, nothing about the hundreds of thousands who had died because of his signatures. Just an appeal for mercy for Germany. The trapdoor opened at 4:18 a.m. The drop was not sufficient. Adler's neck did not break cleanly. He strangled slowly at the end of the rope. It took 14 minutes for him to die. His body twitched and convulsed while witnesses watched in silence. Finally, a medical officer checked for pulse. Found none. Pronounced him dead at 1:28 a.m. Victor Adler was the highest-ranking German military officer executed for war crimes. All his obedience, all his loyalty, all his signatures had led him to this, strangling slowly in a prison gymnasium while cameras recorded every moment. 2 field marshals had been sentenced to hang at Nuremberg. One died on schedule. One died on his own terms. But both died. That was the only certainty. While Adler and Kruger were facing justice in Nuremberg, other field marshals were facing a different kind of reckoning in the Soviet Union. Gustav Lindemann had surrendered to American forces in May 1945. He was a panzer commander, brilliant tactician, had led the breakthrough at the Ardennes in 1940, had commanded armored drives deep into Soviet territory in 1942. The Americans held him for 6 months, then transferred him to Yugoslav authorities to face war crimes charges. The Yugoslavs held him for another year, then handed him to the Soviets. The Soviets wanted trophies. They wanted German generals they could parade and prosecute and punish. Lindemann was perfect. Senior rank, Eastern Front service, plenty of blood on his hands. He was tried by a Soviet military tribunal in 1947. The trial was a formality. The verdict was predetermined. 25 years hard labor. Lindemann was sent to Vladimir Prison, 120 miles east of Moscow, a fortress built by Catherine the Great. Thick walls, tiny cells, isolation, silence. He spent 7 years there. 7 years in a cell barely large enough to lie down. 7 years of interrogations and forced confessions and propaganda sessions. 7 years watching other German officers die from disease, malnutrition, suicide. His wife wrote letters. They were never delivered. She had no idea if he was alive or dead. The Soviets provided no information. Prisoners simply disappeared into the system. In November 1954, a guard found Lindemann dead in his cell. Heart failure, the official report said. He was 73 years old. His body was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery. His family learned of his death 6 months later through Red Cross channels. They never received his body, never had a funeral. He simply vanished into the Soviet prison system and ceased to exist. Gustav Lindemann had been one of the most successful panzer commanders of the war. His tactical innovations were studied in military academies. His campaigns had covered thousands of miles. He had commanded hundreds of thousands of men, and he died alone in a prison cell, forgotten by everyone except his jailers. 3 other field marshals died in Soviet captivity. The pattern was always the same: arrest, trial, prison, years of isolation, death from illness or age or simple despair, unmarked graves, families left wondering. The Soviets wanted revenge more than justice, and they got it. German generals rotted in Soviet prisons while the world forgot they existed. But not all field marshals faced execution or Soviet camps. Some were tried by Western tribunals and received sentences that were surprisingly lenient. Some were never tried at all, and one managed to not only survive, but to rebuild his reputation and live out his years in comfort and honor. Franz von Hartmann was arrested by British forces in May 1945. He was the most famous German strategist of the war, the architect of the French campaign, the defensive genius of the Eastern Front. Military historians considered him brilliant, but he had also commanded in areas where the SS and Einsatzgruppen had conducted mass murders. He had known what was happening. He had done nothing to stop it. The British debated what to do with him. Put him on trial? For what specific charges? He had not ordered the killings, had not participated directly. His crime was inaction, turning a blind eye, focusing on military operations while atrocities occurred in his zones of responsibility. In 1949, 4 years after the war ended, Hartmann was finally tried by a British military tribunal. The charges were specific: failure to protect civilian populations under his command, transmitting criminal orders to subordinates without objection. The trial lasted 3 months. The evidence was damning. Einsatzgruppen reports showed massacres occurring in areas Hartmann controlled. His own staff officers testified that he had been informed. Some said he had expressed private distaste but taken no action. Hartmann's defense was consistent. He was a soldier focused on military operations. SS actions were not under his authority. He had no legal power to prevent them. His responsibility was to the front, not to policing other German organizations. The tribunal convicted him, but the sentence was surprisingly light: 18 years imprisonment. Hartmann served 4 years. In 1953, citing deteriorating health and changed political circumstances, the British released him. Cold War politics had shifted priorities. A brilliant German general who understood Soviet tactics was now more valuable as a consultant than as a prisoner. Hartmann walked out of prison at age 67. He had lost 4 years. Most of the men I have shown you had lost everything. He settled in Bavaria, began writing his memoirs. Lost Victories became a military bestseller. It presented Hartmann as a pure soldier, a professional who had served Germany, not the regime, a genius frustrated by Hitler's interference, a man who had simply done his military duty. The memoirs were masterful, brilliant military analysis combined with careful framing of his own role. He acknowledged that atrocities had occurred, but positioned himself as separate from them, a soldier fighting a military war while politicians and SS conducted a criminal one. The book sold thousands of copies, were studied at West Point and Sandhurst, shaped how a generation understood the German officer corps, helped create the myth of the clean Wehrmacht, the idea that the regular German military had fought honorably while the SS committed atrocities. It was a comfortable lie, and Hartmann profited from it enormously. By the 1960s, he was advising the West German Bundeswehr, consulting for NATO, writing analysis of Soviet military doctrine. He was respected, honored, treated as an elder statesman of military affairs. In 1967, a journalist interviewed him about his wartime service. The journalist was young, had not lived through the war, but had studied the history carefully. Field Marshal, you commanded Army Group Don in Ukraine during 1942 and 1943. Einsatzgruppen reports document thousands of executions in areas under your operational control. Were you aware of these activities? Hartmann's face remained neutral. He had been asked this question before, had prepared his answer years ago. I was focused on military operations against the Red Army. The Eastern Front required complete attention. SS operations were conducted by separate organizations with separate chains of command. But you were the senior military commander in the region. You had authority to restrict access, to file complaints, to create obstacles. I had no legal authority over SS units. You had moral authority. You were a field marshal. Hartmann was silent for a moment. This was pushing harder than most interviewers dared. War is not conducted in a moral vacuum. I understand that now. Perhaps I understood it then, but my duty was to my soldiers, to the military situation. If I had spent my time fighting political battles with the SS, I would have failed in my primary responsibility. Is that enough? To say you focused on your military duty while thousands were being murdered? Another pause, longer this time. It will have to be. I cannot change the past. I can only tell you that I did what I believed was right at the time, given the situation I faced. It was the most honest answer Hartmann ever gave, and the most damning, because it acknowledged that he had made a choice, that he had weighed military efficiency against human lives in chosen efficiency, that his brilliance as a strategist had been purchased with moral compromise. The interview was published, created some controversy, but not much. By 1967, people were tired of the war, tired of reckoning, tired of judgment. They wanted to move forward, and Hartmann was helping them do that by showing that German military professionalism could be separated from Nazi criminality. Franz von Hartmann died on June 9, 1973. He was 85 years old. He died peacefully in his sleep in his comfortable home in Bavaria. He was buried with military honors. Former soldiers attended his funeral. NATO officers sent wreaths. He had lived 28 years after the war ended, long enough to rebuild his reputation, long enough to profit from his brilliance, long enough to never fully answer for what he had enabled. History has not absolved him, but it let him die in peace and comfort and honor, which is more than most of the men I have shown you received. Let me give you the complete statistical accounting now. All 26 men, every fate, executed by Allied authorities. 2 men, Victor Adler, hanged at Nuremberg, Joachim Jodl, hanged at Nuremberg, executed by the Nazi regime. 1 man, Ernst Richter, hanged with piano wire for treason. Suicide, 5 men, Wilhelm Steinberg, forced cyanide after ultimatum. Otto Brenner, pistol in a forest. Günther von Kluge, cyanide in his staff car. Hermann Kruger, cyanide in his cell. Robert von Greim, hospital poison after promotion. Died in Soviet captivity. 3 men. Gustav Lindemann, Vladimir prison. Walter von Seidlitz, defected but still imprisoned. Ferdinand Schörner, returned to Germany but convicted of executing German soldiers. Died in Western custody, awaiting trial. 2 men. Werner von Blomfeld, heart failure. Walter von Brauchitsch, heart failure. Killed in combat or accidents, 3 men. Feder von Bock, strafed by aircraft days before surrender. Walter von Reichenau, stroke and plane crash. Eduard von Boehmer-Molly, peacetime death after honorary promotion. Tried and convicted but survived, 9 men. Franz von Hartmann, released after 4 years. Erich von Manstein, same. Gerd von Rundstedt, released due to health. Wilhelm von Lieb, sentenced to time served. Albert Kesselring, death sentence commuted. And others who served minimal time or were released for health reasons. 1 defector, Heinrich Vogel, surrendered at Stalingrad, lived in East Germany until 1957. 26 men, 26 different paths, but the pattern that emerges is unmistakable. Some faced the rope, some the camps, some old age. But every single one discovered that what they had been promised was illusion. I am 75 years old now. I fought in Vietnam. I taught at West Point. I have spent 40 years studying these men and their choices. People sometimes ask me what the lesson is, what we should learn from these 26 fates. The lesson is simple, and it should terrify anyone who wears a uniform. Professional excellence does not protect you. Tactical brilliance does not save you. Following orders is not a defense, and claiming you were just a soldier is not enough. Every one of these men believed they were serving honorably. Vogel thought obedience was virtue. Richter thought resistance required timing. Steinberg thought you could remain neutral. Adler thought following orders absolved responsibility. Brenner thought duty justified any sacrifice. Hartmann thought you could separate military professionalism from moral complicity. They were all wrong. What they believed was a covenant was manipulation from the beginning. Hitler never intended to honor it. And the idea that you could serve brilliantly in an evil cause while remaining personally honorable was the greatest delusion of all. Here is what I learned from studying these men. Your oath is not to a person, not to a flag, not even to a nation. Your oath is to principles, constitution, laws, human dignity, basic morality. When orders conflict with those principles, you have a choice. Richter made one choice, Adler made another. Both were field marshals. Both faced consequences, but only one died with his honor intact. The men who followed criminal orders told themselves they had no choice. They did. They chose comfort over conscience, career over character, obedience over humanity. And when the reckoning came, those choices mattered more than any tactical victory or strategic brilliance. Brenner died believing he had preserved his honor. But honor that serves no purpose except self-satisfaction is just another word for pride. He could have saved 300,000 lives by surrendering. He chose his principles instead. Was that honor, or just selfishness dressed in military virtue? Hartmann lived to 85, wrote best-selling books, advised NATO, died peacefully and honored, but he enabled mass murder through inaction. Is survival the same as justice? Is comfort the same as absolution? I do not have clean answers. War is not a morality play. History is not simple. These men were not cartoon villains. They were professionals who made choices in impossible situations, but that is precisely why their fates matter. Because impossible situations are where character is revealed. When the easy path leads to atrocity and the hard path leads to consequences, your choice defines who you are. 26 men received the field marshal's baton. Some broke it through resistance. Some held it through fanatical obedience. Some used it as a shield for moral compromise. But every single one of them discovered that what they called a promise was actually an invoice. And history collected payment from all of them. I visit Arlington National Cemetery once a year. Walk among the white headstones of American soldiers who served in wars just and unjust. I remove my colonel's insignia, place it on a grave, not because I am ashamed of my service, but because I understand what it represents. Metal and cloth, symbols of authority. But authority without conscience is just power, and power without principle is just force. Those 26 German field marshals made their choices. Some honorable, some contemptible, most somewhere between. But every single one discovered the same truth. History does not forget. Justice may be delayed, imperfect, incomplete. But it arrives. And when it does, no amount of tactical brilliance offers absolution. No claim of following orders provides defense. No professional excellence grants sanctuary. All that remains is the choice you made when duty and conscience diverged. Make it a choice you can live with. Because unlike these 26 men, you might actually have to. 26 men, 26 fates, one lesson that echoes across 80 years. Duty without conscience is not honor, it is complicity.